On behalf of the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies at the CUNY Graduate Center, it is our pleasure to host this book launch for Sergio Palencia on Caste Rebellion, the origins of the Guatemalan plantation state. We have some distinguished panelists who are going to be offering their commentary. I am happy to, I also want to thank the Department of Anthropology for their co-sponsorship of the event tonight. And I'm going to hand it over to Andreina Torres. I think just for run of show logistics, to add, we will be holding all of the Q&A at the end of the event, but feel free to drop those questions in the chat during the kind of conversation, and we will collect them and pose them to the commentators and to the author at the end tonight. Thank you. Welcome for, thank you so much for joining us. And I am handing it to my distinguished colleague, Andreina Torres, to do the proper introductions. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Victoria. Thank you, everybody, for being here this evening. We are very excited to host this event. You know, CLACO's mission is always to support graduate students in their work. We are very excited to have Sergio present his book. So first we'll have presentations from all our commentators, and then we'll have a little bit more of discussion with the speakers, and then we'll open it up for the Q&A. So we'll start with Maria Luisa Mendonca from the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics at CUNY. She's an expert on the political economy of agriculture and geopolitical resistance by rural social movements in Brazil and internationally. She is the author of The Political Economy of Agribusiness. Thank you, Maria Luisa, and we can begin with your comments.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to participate in this discussion. Very happy to be here. Thank you very much, Sergio, for your wonderful work. And this is, Sergio provides us with a wonderful take on historic dialectical materialism. And he also brings original information about rebellion and counter-revolution in Guatemala, starting in the 19th century. And the book focuses the analysis on three main categories: land, labor, and capital. And Sergio defines those categories as a social relation. And he also looks at these categories and points to contradictions that allow us to see possibilities for resistance and transformation. So this analysis is based on Marx' primitive accumulation, and Marx points to three main elements that was part of when he was looking at primitive accumulation at that time during the transition from feudalism to capitalism. The first was the enclosure of peasant land, and the second was the so-called bloody laws to force peasants to work in manufacturing. And Marx uses an ironic image as that he said that workers were free like birds in an ironic way, meaning that no labor is actually free labor, meaning that wage labor is also a form of forced labor. And Sergio uses the concept of abstract labor also based on the dialectical relation between use value and exchange value to present the case of resistance in Guatemala. And the third element of primitive accumulation is colonization. So colonization was a key element in the expansion of capitalism globally. And this is also a key point in the book. And that also made me think of historian Caio Prado Jr., Brazilian historian. He defines colonial Brazil as a corporation, not as a country, because the role of colonial Brazil was mainly to provide sugar, which was a main commodity, to European countries. And at that time, Brazil didn't export raw sugarcane. It exported manufactured sugar, meaning that it had technology to produce this main global commodity that changed actually eating habits in Europe, had an important global impact. At that time, it was a main commodity, but still that was under colonial relations. And those types of questions are presented in the book in a very interesting way. Sergio points out to how coffee was a main commodity during colonial times and after, in the transition from colonialism to capitalist relations in Guatemala. And that also determines resistance by indigenous communities around land. So, land is a central point of disputes in the history of capitalism. And that also, in not just in the history of the transition between feudalism, from feudalism to capitalism, but land is a central element for the reproduction of capital. And that also made me think of Rosa Luxemburg, because what Marx was looking at that time was defining primitive accumulation as a prehistory of capitalism. But then Rosa Luxemburg identified primitive accumulation throughout the history of capitalist reproduction as actually a key element in that process. So that also made me think about how the book, the historical period that Sergio presents in the book, helped me understand most recent events. For example, the military coups, the series of military coups in Latin America that started in Guatemala in 1954, that also had land and agricultural commodities as central points. And of course, the role of United Fruit Corporation was key in that process. And the book is also important for us to understand the role of land today in geopolitical disputes, and also the role of indigenous and peasant communities to defend the land, to defend food sovereignty, to deal with the climate crisis that we face now, and also the role that financial capital, agribusiness corporations, and their connection with local elites in Latin America create those types of neo-colonial relations that we see until today. The plantation system, the monocropping, the agribusiness, extensive monocropping system that still is a main struggle that we have in Latin America. And, and Sergio works helps us understand a process that is very much relevant to what we see happening today in Latin America and in other countries. So thank you very much. I'm happy to be here and participate in the discussion.
Thank you so much, Maria Luisa. We'll continue with Mary Roldán's presentation. Mary Roldán is a professor at Hunter College, CUNY. She holds the Dorothy Epstein Chair in Latin American History, and she specializes in 20th century Colombian social, political history, and state formation. She's the author of Blood and Fire, La Violencia en Antioquia, Colombia, from 1946 to 1953. Welcome, Mary.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and it's a real pleasure to be here to comment on this incredibly interesting and dense book that Sergio, I say that with admiration, not as a criticism, that Sergio Palencia has written and that we're launching here. There's so much in this book that I decided that my entry point would be in part as a historian and also related to questions that Sergio knows reverberate for me in thinking about places like Colombia as well. And so I decided I would kind of focus on a few themes. One is that in this book, and I have to say here that Sergio approaches his project, I was trying to think of what the appropriate analogy would be, but it's almost like someone who, in an effort to revise and reconstruct the past, dismantles it stone by stone, like a structure, and then very carefully repositions those very same stones, but in somewhat different ways from the way in which the historical narrative has traditionally. So it's the same structure, but now the rooms are slightly different and the corridors that connect them are slightly different, and the overall effect, if you will, of analyzing history from Sergio's perspective transforms our understanding, really, both of the importance of indigenous rebellion, but also of the ways and historical evolution of issues, even as certain things remain constant in that indigenous in those indigenous actions in Guatemala from the late colonial period through 1940. So he challenges this static conception of the indigenous as somehow never changing, or as remaining tied because they do identify with a particular set of customs and a communal land system that has certain kinds of implications that somehow they're incapable of, or remain kind of static over the course of society and don't respond to evolving historical circumstances or issues. And this he very carefully and I think persuasively contests. First, by teasing out the ways in which even as the defense of communal land and the use value, which are central to the indigenous system, remain constant, that is not static, but constant, for indigenous groups from the colonial period, especially the late Bourbon reform period of the late 18th century through the present, the actual alliances that indigenous groups form from the colonial period to the present, the mobilization and factors that shape indigenous rebellion shift and respond to evolving pressures and issues over time. So what motivates the desire to preserve and protect indigenous land, communal land, is central and unchanging. But the particular kinds of pressures or historical events or issues that push indigenous populations to take up rebellion and who they ally with and what tactical forms they take do shift over time in response to this evolving kind of historical panorama. Second, I was really struck by, and Sergio will know that this resonates with my own interest, the ways in which he's very careful to tease out and describe and trace the connections between the local, the regional, and the national. And so the oppression of indigenous groups and their construction as a specific caste system, and I'm actually going to come back to this idea of caste, maybe in the questions period, if I don't get to it now, is something that is constant, and it occurs at the national level, or the imperial level during the colonial period, at the national level in the post-independence period. But the ways in which specific indigenous groups interact with what is happening at the national level has very much to do with their specific regional and local circumstances. And he shows that very carefully, particularly over the course of the 19th century, in which he traces, for instance, a number of different rebellions and what appeared to be the contradictory, for instance, alliance, apparently contradictory or paradoxical alliance between indigenous support for someone like Rafael Carrera, who becomes a representative of the Conservative Party. From the outside, this makes no sense, and it's been something that's been criticized in the historiography. In fact, as Sergio presents the reasons for indigenous support, it makes total sense. And his argument, which is quite challenging, that conservative government is actually revolutionary or rebellion, and it will be the imposition or the triumph of liberal reforms in the late 1860s, culminating in 1871, that will form the counter-revolution, is ultimately persuasive. And I hope we might be able to kind of talk a little bit about that over the course of the discussion once Sergio has presented his book. Third, I particularly like here, and this is something that people like Charles Walker in his book about smoldering ashes in Peru from the late 1700s through 1840 also does, and to some degree Violencia Malin in Peasant and Nation, where she looks at Peru and Mexico and the construction of the state and popular participation in the military conflicts between liberals and conservatives over the course of the 19th century, also gestures at, and that is that historically, in the literature, the caudillo, the 19th century is characterized as kind of the era of the caudillo, or the strongman. And almost inevitably, when there is popular support of the caudillo or an alliance with them, it's assumed that it's because those groups are manipulated. They're dupes, right? They follow, or they are forced to, because they are the dependents and private armies of specific regional power men, and they don't really have a choice. And what both of those authors, Walker and Violencia Malin, and what is very evident here in Sergio's work, is that that's not the case. There may be very real and powerful reasons for supporting these particular caudillos, and they rely on and need that support in order to be able to bring to coalescence, if you will, their objective in constructing a particular kind of state. And those reasons, the very same reasons that might have motivated, for instance, indigenous groups to support a conservative party and someone like Rafael Carrera, may also become the reasons why they will then repudiate that particular group and potentially, possibly even align with certain interests of a liberal regime in 1871. And here, concretely, he looks at the growing imposition and centralization of revenue through the liquor monopoly and the way this affects people at the local and regional level. So there's a kind of revisionism of rethinking that idea, which was very popular and kind of a staple, if you will, of Latin American historiography of the 19th century, as this long period of caudillo rule in which the popular classes, to the degree that they support those caudillos, do so because they are cannon fodder, they don't have any other option, or because they are dupes of some kind of populist discourse that ultimately never includes them. But in fact, what Sergio shows, I think, very persuasively, is that these indigenous rebellions are absolutely critical to empowering or making possible the rise to power of particular groups. And that the state, as it consolidates itself in the Guatemalan case as increasingly a finquero state that is defended by a military whose purpose is to ensure that the national interests are the interests of that very restricted caste of Creole elite agro-commercial producers in conjunction with foreign interests, for instance, is precisely a response to indigenous rebellion, a response to indigenous mobilization from the late colonial period all the way to the contemporary period. So it's a way of reading, and this is a fourth and very important point, I think, in Sergio's work, that contrary to what often appears in the historiography, indigenous people are not invisible, they're not the sidelines, they're not random simply because they may not have centralized or coordinated mobilizations among different indigenous groups over the course of history, but that it is fundamentally the threat, the very real threat of indigenous mobilization and the possibility that it can tank, if you will, the desire to construct this state in the interest of a very limited Spanish or then later Creole agro-commercial caste, that explains the need to actually construct a highly centralized, oppressive, and violent regime to put that indigenous challenge down. And finally, because I think I might be exceeding my time, I also want to say that one of the things that's really interesting in this book is that it's a revision and challenge to the idea of a kind of seamless state building narrative that has emerged in the official history of places, not just like Guatemala, but other places, for instance, in which there's a temptation at times, and Sergio is very careful to keep us honest as scholars by constantly reminding us of the fact that what we think we saw there isn't actually what might have been going on, or have the meaning that has been ascribed to it by traditional historiographies. He really forces us to not think about the past from the perspective of the present, but in fact to see the importance of very gradually, back to that building analogy, deconstructing the ways in which the past has been, especially the relationship and contradictions between the indigenous caste and the Spanish or Creole caste, has been constructed in a place like Guatemala to understand why the particular finquero state that eventually emerged and the conditions that that created for labor, taxation, the pressures on communal land emerged in the way they did. It wasn't random. There's an embeddedness to that. It goes back to the colonial period, but it isn't static and it evolves. And it provides clues for us to understand the contemporary situation in a place like Guatemala. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary, for your comments. We'll continue with Mark Edelman, professor at Hunter College, CUNY. Mark works at the intersection of agrarian issues, social movements, and human rights. In Central America, he analyzed changing land tenure, land use patterns, and rural class relations. He's the author of The Logic of the Latifundio. Thank you, Mark, for joining us today.
Thank you, Andreina, and thank you to Claxels for the invitation, and a salute to Sergio for having written this fantastic book. There were a number of times when I was reading this book when I thought back to something I heard in the mid-1990s at the Central American Sociology Congress in San Salvador, where the keynote address was given by the eminent sociologist Alberto Torres Rivas. And I remember very vividly his opening line. He said, "We Guatemalan Latinos have not had a good night's sleep in 500 years." And of course, what he was referring to was the Guerra de Castas, this nightmare of the Guatemalan elites, that the Indians would descend out of the mountains and that the last would be first, and that there would be a social inversion or revolution of some kind. Sergio's book is a remarkable, wide-ranging, very erudite reinterpretation of Guatemalan history that spans a very long period from roughly from the Bourbon reforms of the mid 18th century to just before the Guatemalan Spring, the very brief Guatemalan Democratic Spring of the 1940s up until 1954. And I have to say that I read this book with the same excitement that I had when I first encountered work by people like Severo Martinez Peláez, Julio Castellanos, David McCreary, Arturo Taracena, and the other Guatemalan scholars that Sergio is in some ways reinterpreting and standing on the shoulders of. The analytical thread that runs through Sergio's account is this system of estamentos, or estates. And it's a complicated term. He acknowledges that his use of it comes from Max Weber. Weber, of course, was thinking partly of the estates of the Ancien Regime in France that were hereditary hierarchies of privileges and prerogatives and wealth. But unlike in pre-revolutionary France, the estamentos in Guatemala reflected and organized a rigid racial order with Euro-descendant Ladinos on top, along with some Germans and North Americans and others, and the indigenous majority, because it's the majority on the bottom, a pigmentocracy, as Sergio calls it at one point. And the main thrust of the book is to examine the different ways in which this form of estate-based oppression shifted over time, intensified and shifted over time. There's a conventional narrative about Central American history, which Mary in a way alluded to, which is that there are these, in the immediate post-independence period, there's this tension between conservatives, pro-clerical conservatives on the one hand, and modernizing liberals on the other hand, and the pendulum swings back and forth, and you have Mariano Galvez in the beginning, and then you have Carrera, and then you have Barrios. And one of the things I found really meaningful about Sergio's reinterpretation of this history is that he rejects this interpretation based on regimes. And he says it very explicitly in those terms. It's not a question of regimes, it's a question of the changes and the processes that are occurring on the ground that constitute and create the possibility for these other forces to emerge. So it's very much a bottom-up history, and a history that revolves around the reorganization of space and property and the forms of expropriating land and using labor to accumulate wealth. So it's not that all of a sudden in 1871 everything changes and you get coffee and you begin to get railroads and you begin to get links to the global economy. These processes were growing over a longer period of time, just maybe not as visible at the political cupola of the society. So it's not just a question of rejecting a history based on regimes, it's a question of pointing to continuities between estate-based forms of oppression that existed under the first liberal regime, then the conservative regime, and then the other, the liberal revolution of Barrios and so on. So it's a book where the analysis is more subtle, and I think for that reason, more groundbreaking and original and meaningful. So one of the other things that I think is important to highlight in talking about this book is that Sergio probes the impacts of this on the people most affected. And at the level of physicality and habitus, he talks about the ways in which the society had proscriptions on, for example, indigenous men being in the presence of Ladina women, how indigenous people were supposed to avert their gaze when in the presence of a Ladino. They were supposed to step off the sidewalk if Ladinos were walking in the opposite direction down the sidewalk. So, and the flip side of that is the consolidation of an elite in Guatemala, which Sergio demonstrates, believed deeply in its inherent right to be served. Its right to be served, and an elite that was among the most voracious and intransigent of any upper class group in the Americas. So these are, I think, important ways of looking both from the top and from the bottom that Sergio draws out, and that are cultural and psychological and emotional dimensions of these historical phenomena that are not always that present in many of the more sociological interpretations of this history. One of the things that I really appreciated about this book is that, well, Sergio uses Marxist categories, as Maria Luisa was saying before, particularly the distinction between use value and exchange value. He employs them not in a scriptural way, but in a heterodox and creative way. And he makes a very persuasive argument, I think, that what happened in Guatemala was not about capitalism in the sense of a system based on free labor or on ever-increasing labor productivity and accumulation in the sense that capitalism has come to have in what are sometimes called developed countries, a category I'm a little skeptical of these days. But he points out that this process of mercantilization was what connected Guatemala to these broader circuits of capital, and it fueled the accumulation of the Guatemalan upper classes and of the coffee bourgeoisie. So this process occurred through extra economic coercion, through brutal kinds of force, through racialized oppression that affected the bodies of the Indian people who were in that system. And it was based on land seized from the Indians that limited their social reproduction, but not entirely, because unlike the caricature of the liberal regime as seizing everything, the liberals were astute enough to recognize that they had to assure the social and physical reproduction of the subordinated group in some way. And the easiest way to do that was to leave them just a little bit of land. The remainder of the community lands that were maybe too high up for coffee or not suitable for coffee. So despite all of the rhetoric associated with the liberal regime, particularly after 1871, about modernization, about markets, about free markets, and so on and so forth, it was very much a regime based on coercion in the Gramscian sense. So there's a lot more I could say about this really extraordinary book, or about its amazing and prolific author. But I think it's probably best to just simply close by congratulating Sergio once again and thanking him for writing the book, and Claxels for the opportunity to comment on it.
Great, thank you so much, Mark. And now we'll hear from Sergio Palencia, author of the book. Sergio is a doctoral student, a doctoral candidate in anthropology at the Graduate Center CUNY, and he traces the history of the Guatemalan guerrilla rebellion and the military genocide in between 1980 and 1984 in his research. Welcome, Sergio.
Thank you so much, Andreina. Good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here First of all, I would like to thank Clax, Victoria Stone, and Andreina Torres. Thank you so much for opening this space for this dialogue. I appreciate so much this possibility of sharing this idea with professors that I admire a lot, from which I have learned a lot in the last 4 years. In this sense, thank you, Professor Edelman, Roldán, and Mendonça, for accepting the invitation for this, for commenting this book. If you listen to music in the ambience, is that I am actually in a community in Guatemala, in a village, and I'm like in the middle of between a Catholic church and an evangelical church, but I hope that this is not going to be too problematic. Okay, so that said, I would also like to say that I'm very happy that many colleagues and friends, both from the US and Guatemala, are here, including Mario Vasquez from UNAM, who was one of the scholars who supported the publication of this book in the Autonomous University of Mexico. And also Ramon González Ponciano, who actually wrote the preface to this book. So I just wanted to say hello to them as well. Okay, so I prepare a brief presentation with some of the aspects that I consider I would like to share with you. So I'm going to share this PowerPoint presentation, and okay. So I would like to start with the photo cover. Why did I choose this photo cover? This photo was taken by Megan Thomas, who used to be part of the insurgency in Guatemala in the 1980s, and she went to the northwestern part of Guatemala. And that was by June 1981, in a moment in which many villages in Guatemala were supporting a revolution against the military government that originated from the US coup in 1954. So I was always wondering about what is the meaning of this kind of photograph? Why many people were supporting the revolution, at least in this photograph? What are the complexities behind this photograph? What can we see about it? So in that sense, this book is rooted on 3 historical experiences. One of them is that after observing this kind of photograph or images, I went to different places, villages, and territories in Guatemala that experienced both the uprising in 1980, 1981, and at the same time, the military genocide in 1982, 1983. So 2 main narratives were present in this moment. One of them, of course, the military dictatorship, the repression, the guerrilla warfare as well. But at the same time, many people, they talk about their experiences in plantations, in fincas, as they know it in Guatemala, Chiapas, or Central America. So in that sense, they would talk about their grandparents or grandmothers going to the Pacific South Coast in Guatemala to work in cotton plantations, sugar mills, coffee plantations. And that was like something that was always present. So when I returned back then, I was studying in Mexico. I started thinking it will be good to trace not only what happened in the war as such between 1966 or 1954 and 1983, but what about trying to trace not only state formation in Guatemala, but the struggles that ignited this conflict way before Che Guevara was born, for example. So I wanted to know some of these aspects way before the framework of a Cold War. So in that sense, one of the goals of this book was to trace the historical forces behind the Guatemalan War, the revolution and genocide. The second would be to understand the enormous struggle in the long 19th century, like between Maya indigenous communities and caste labor forms, or finca in that sense. And basically to overcome a state-based interpretation of wars and conflicts from a hopefully a renewed interpretation of class struggle. So this book is both an historical sociological approach, but this is a Marxist book, and I want to say it. It comes from, I feel identified with some of these aspects that Marx develops through dialectics, and I thought it would be good to create this dialogue between history and some of these broader perspectives in Marx's work. So in that sense, what is the context of this? Well, basically, during the 1990s, there was the end of civil wars in Central America, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, as you can see in these photographs. And this historical period also created a certain narrative of the origins of the civil war in Central America. So in that sense, when we think, we could talk about different sociological approaches or anthropological during the 1990s. I just want to focus on two truth commissions in Guatemala, which they contributed a lot to the understanding of what happened in terms of numbers, in terms of the political violence, in terms of the human rights violations. And at the same time, they produce a certain narrative that the war was basically between a national army and leftist guerrillas. So this was like the main idea behind truth commissions. But what about the expression? Why do we find insurgencies in this historical moment? What is the product of this? How can we understand these processes? So in that sense, I wanted to trace this. This is a photograph of a coffee plantation taken by the very famous English photographer Edward Muybridge in 1875 of a finca Las Nubes. So when we see this photograph, for example, what is behind this photograph? What is the specificity of space and time that is condensed in this moment? So one of the aspects was, okay, why do we find, for example, during the war in Guatemala, that many of the first civil patrols, they were created in fincas, in plantations? How do we trace these aspects in the sense of a much more dense historical interpretation together with indigenous or non-indigenous peasant communities? So the hypothesis in this work is the following. I translated this from the book, so it's more or less like this. Plantation is a division of the indigenous communal body, not only in geographical and territorial terms, but from communities' own social forces into commodity productive forces. Thus, the more power and strength the finca society has, the greater the process of impoverishment of the concrete community and its members. So in that sense, the more empowered or consolidated a plantation state is, the more exploited plebeian indigenous communities are in that sense. So in that sense, the nucleus of plantation and planters relationships is war, a constant and multiform war. So this is, I wanted to trace this aspect because the Cold War didn't bring this. It was only an historical expression of something that was before. And it is not something only related with feudal lords in a very distant mountain in places like Guatemala or El Salvador. This is an expression of capitalism, of world capitalism. So how do we understand dialectics between the local expression of fincas as ground rent appropriation, but at the same time as a moment of global capitalism? So in that sense, we understand the fincas also together with the expansion and the consolidation of a certain caste army. In this sense, this is this similar Edward Muybridge photograph. I call it El Ejército Estamental. So it was basically a non-indigenous army by the end of the 19th century. This would change during the 20th century, but it's part of the consolidation of the finca, how finca and militarism are both two sides of the same coin. So, and that is another photograph of the same phenomenon happening in the same year, in the 6 months that Edward Muybridge lived in Guatemala. So indigenous peoples forced to work in coffee plantations. So just to finish with these ideas, the book is divided into two main parts. The first one is called A Moving Forest, the meaning of the colonial and caste crisis between 1780 and 1860. And the second part, I call it La embestida finquera, the finca assault, plantation as caste subordination between 1860 and 1940. So 3 main ideas. Well, each part is divided into more or less 3 or 2 chapters, but I just want to emphasize 3 ideas. The first one is an historical understanding of caste categories. So when we call about when the colonial categories of Indio, Español, Ladino, or Criollo, in that sense, these are not only ethnic expressions. We have to understand the colonial, the caste expression or order in order to understand the historical content of this one. It is not the same to talk about the Ladino in the 16th century than in the 19th century when the finca system arrives. So there are like nuances that are very important to understand. Secondly, there would be like how to reinterpret struggle in a moment that we cannot talk of free labor, as Professor Edelman was saying. So in that sense, I propose to use the categories of use value and exchange value with the historical specificity of communal use value from peasant indigenous communities and caste exchange value. So how capitalism reproduce a caste, estamento in that sense, or state perspective of appropriation. So that would be an interpretation, a proposition of this conceptualization. And finally, how sometimes we have the idea that revolution is always like within this canon of people organizing to take the power of the state. But what if rebellion moves differently, not reproducing the ideas of taking the power of the state as the main goal of the revolution, as a Leninist or Marxist analysis? But what about if different struggles happening at the same time provoke an interstitial rebellion against, for example, in this case, the first liberals? What about a communal detotalizing struggle? So a revolution that is not focused on the state. So these kind of political experiences or projects were part of the 19th century. And in the second part of the book, analyze the different expression of this struggle, because the finca, the plantation, promotes a certain time, certain specialization of the territory, a certain use or attack of the indigenous body, not only in terms of, let's say, the flesh, but also about the mountains, the rivers. This is to think body also as a relationship. So a struggle between indigenous communities and plantations. In that sense, how do we consider the difference between caste struggle or class struggle? How do we find the different historical moments related with these two differentiations, so land grabbing and ground rent accumulation, to discern, to understand the historical forms that express this conflict? And finally, the book ends on a certain moment on the 1940s, on the brink of one of Latin America's major anti-plantation revolutions. So it started as a military and urban struggle in 1944 in what has been called as the Revolución de Octubre in the Guatemalan history. But later, 6 years after that, it starts a radicalization of the process and the agrarian reform in 1951, 1952. So how do we understand not only plantation as within the relationship of Guatemalans and Germans, for example, but also what happened with US intervention in the 1950s? This is not part of the book, but I just want to bring to that moment why the Guatemalan war must be seen from this perspective of a major anti-plantation revolution, both from national capitals and in that sense, international capitals. So the idea would be, how do we understand in these photos from 1875 some of the aspects that happened 100 years later when people were ready to fight against the army, and how the genocide is not only about a military genocide, we're talking about a plantation genocide in that sense. So to try to link both aspects of it. I want to thank your attention, and I will be.
Thank you, Sergio, for that wonderful presentation. I'm sure there's a lot to talk about at this point. But before we go into the Q&A and get questions from everybody in the audience, I would just like to give the floor again to our commentators in case you have any other comments, questions, and then we open it up. We can go in the same order. Starting with Maria Luisa.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sergio. So yeah, I just have a brief comment. I think that, yeah, the way you tell the story of this, large historical period and look and at the same time bring these main categories for us to understand what was happening at that time and the struggles that were happening, I think also brings something that is very original in your work, which is you talk about class struggles, but from an indigenous perspective. So in this way, your analysis is based on Marxist theory, but it's not, of course, from an orthodox perspective. It's from a dialectical perspective and looking at how the concept of labor and class is based on certain social relations and how it's important for us to understand that in different contexts and not to reject something because we are looking at a particular context, in your case, in Guatemala. So you look at a particular moment in history in a particular territory, but at the same time, you speak to the totality of capital, to capital as a totality. You use that concept in the book as well, which I think is very helpful for us to understand large historical periods as well as things that are happening right now. And the same thing about forms of organizing. So I think it's important what you explained now. I think that was, it became more clear to me is that there are forms of organizing that sometimes are not visible, right? That is, the history that is usually invisible. And that's what you bring in your book. You make that visible. So because indigenous peoples were not organizing in the formal way that we usually understand organizing of, the working class, it seems that is invisible. So when an event happens, rebellion or something, so where does it come from? So because there are diverse forms of resistance and organizing that are usually not visible, and that is very important for us to understand the historical periods and events. So I think that it's a very important contribution. So thank you again.
Thank you, Maria Luisa. Mary, do you want to continue?
Thank you. I really liked your presentation, Sergio, in addition to it being a wonderful book, because you introduced certain elements that led me to think about your process in putting together sources and why you chose the methodology that you did. And it was those photographs and reconstructing history from using a visual archive, right? Not just an archive that is either written or the things that get, or if you conducted oral histories, but actually using those photographs to really think about the way in which, and I was very struck by the comment that you made, which is that the nucleus of plantation and planters' relationship is war. And that's reflected as well in the architecture of the plantation. We have, you know, Brazilian examples. We're looking at the way the fazenda was organized and the clearing, for instance, of area around it so that it allowed for a constant ability to survey, for instance, slaves or labor, and ensure that there was not rebellion. It didn't ensure it, but it was a way to both intimidate and also to create those kinds of vehicles for being able to control and monitor, if you will, police indigenous and populations and workers on the plantation. And I wanted to ask you, it was something that you sort of, I thought about as I was reading your book. One of the things that's so interesting about it is that a lot of it are secondary sources, but secondary sources that you have subjected to a very rigorous and critical rethinking, right? So you take information that's been accumulated by other historians, anthropologists, sociologists, but you give it a different kind of read, one that in my view is quite persuasive. And I was wondering to what degree your decision to take up this study and feel that it was quite necessary. And here I'm reading a little bit as a member of your dissertation committee, because I can see the ways in which this is actually kind of a prehistory, a necessary rethinking of the framing, the historical framing, before you can actually do the work that you are currently involved in researching. Because it wouldn't fit within the context of what has been sort of the traditional historiography that exists about the relationship between the indigenous and planters or of Guatemalan history. So I wanted to ask to what degree this book was also motivated, if you will, by the experiences that you had, not just in viewing those photographs, but in actually going out into the field and working with these communities. And if you could talk to us a little bit about that when it comes time in the question and answer. So more than a comment, it's that I'd like to see, because I was really struck by the sophisticated and innovative way in which you bring together different kinds of sources in lieu of actually going out, and you can't possibly do the primary research, for instance, for the colonial period or for the 19th century. You could, but it would take you forever. And so how you bring together both your current kind of research and interests linked to this photographic and visual evidence, to the secondary reworking or rethinking of the material within the secondary sources to construct this alternative interpretation of Guatemalan history. Thanks.
Thank you, Mary, and we'll continue with Mark. Yeah.
So I could look at those Edward Muybridge photographs all day long. They're really just so amazing on so many levels, aesthetically, historically, and a lot of other ways. And he was a pioneer of time-lapse photography too, the kind of predecessor to the motion picture. So a really phenomenal photographer. But like Mary, for some reason at this moment, something, as a member of your dissertation committee, something crystallized for me, which was I saw very concretely the connection between this project in the book and the more recent contemporary project of reconstructing the dynamics of the genocide and the war. It became much clearer to me, and I appreciate that. One thing that the book does, I think, very well, despite this, what could be seen as a kind of presentist interest in that earlier history. One thing that the book does very well is it historicizes its categories of analysis. And this is something that sometimes sociological history doesn't really do sufficiently. And one of the key examples is what you, Sergio, mentioned in passing in your comments just now, which is the changing meaning of the word Ladino, which is so interesting. that in the colonial period, there was this phrase of the Indio Ladino, of the Indian who was Hispanicized, but was still an Indian, but who was perhaps literate even. So there was this figure, and then eventually the category shifts and the usage shifts to refer to one of these estamentos, to the oppressor superordinate group in effect. And the question of revolutions or rebellions that are not focused on the state, I think, is an extremely interesting one, because there's been a tendency in literature on revolution and rebellion and on social movements to think that the antagonist is always the state. Like Chuck Tilley, in one of his 50 million publications, says something like, you don't get any social movements until you get the state, and the social movements are the adversary of the state. Well, what about everything that came before that or occurred on the margins of that? And the same with Hobsbawm and primitive rebels and so on, bandits. There are these categories that are, I think, a little bit influenced more in Hobsbawm's case and in Tilley's by a conventional European Marxist tradition, but which are hugely important and which are often a little bit obscure and difficult to find empirical material that allows us to really understand them on their own terms, as you've done so well. So thank you again. I'll stop there.
Thank you, everybody, for your comments. Sergio, do you want to take a very brief few minutes to answer some of these questions?
Yes, thank you so much for the comments, the professors. Yes, basically, yes, I would like to say that it is very important, the year in which we are born, I think, in the sense of how we become aware of the historical experiences that we have, in the sense of the 1990s and 2000s in Guatemala and Central America, but in general in the world. I think there was this disenchantment of the revolution through certain aspects, through certain interpretations of the world. But for me, this has been a quest also of meeting people. I have really enjoyed doing what I'm doing, because it has taken me towards friendship, towards many aspects, I think. And in that sense, when I read certain interpretations of, for example, anthropologist Charles Hale about the Ladino, and the Ladino was always opposite to indigenous, that is not always the case. So in that sense, how do we rethink some of these categories from the nuances of social relationships? So in that sense, I think it would be important to question some of the historical origins of some of the categories that we have in our countries, and then to rethink what is the experience of people. So yes, I started this research as a sociologist and later as an anthropologist, I think each time hopefully more close to people. So that would be some of the aspects that I would like to say. And I want to thank for the time you took on reading this book, on your comments, and CLACS for organizing this space. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. So now we can take questions from the audience. I'm sure there's plenty to discuss, debate. You can raise your hand or you can write your question on the chat and I'll read it. I'll just keep my eye out on who's raising their hand. There's a question about if the book will be available in English, if there's any plans to make it available in English.
No, there are not plans right now. Yes.
Okay, so I have a comment here. I like Professor Roldán's invitation to hear Sergio discuss how his current project emerges out of this one. So maybe elaborate a little bit more on that. Another comment here. Thank you, Sergio, great talk. I was really interested in your discussion of warfare as a feature of capital class relations and expression of that permanent contraction, and how the war and genocide that occurred in the second half of the 20th century was an intensification of the process which was long-standing. Would you say more about this? And I'll read the last comment in the chat. I was very proud of the scope of the investigations that Sergio has done. Guatemala is a country that has been hit hard by the elites and by the governments. And that is why I admire Sergio's dedication to making Guatemalans and world aware of the reality that has hit our people for years. Congratulations, Sergio. And there's a question. I'll read this question and turn it over to you, Sergio, because there's like 3 questions for now. Avi Chomsky says, I was wondering how you see your interpretation relating to 2 other older approaches, E. Bradford Burns on Rafael Carrera and Eric Wolf on peasant wars. So I'll leave it at that so you can answer.
Yes, related with Professor Roldán comments, I think that this research was my master thesis for the University of Puebla in Mexico. So it was divided into 3 main parts. The 2 parts, the 2 first parts were published in this book. The 3rd part remains as part of the reflections that I've been doing about the war in the 1960s, 1970s. And basically, it was a continuation of thinking how a struggle has been interpreted in Guatemala since 1970, and the concept of racism, for example. But I wanted to hear directly from people that experience this in the sense of, for example, different cooperatives or guerrilla movements or unions. So I started doing some interviews and visits and field visits in 2010, 2011. And one formative experience of this is that I work at the National Police Archive in Guatemala that has one of the biggest collections after the KGB's archive. So this experience was not only about reading the state documents, but also about talking with people, talking with my coworkers, and they would tell me a very different approach from what I heard from truth commissions or some other research in the 1990s, because they would tell me the relationship between Latinos and indigenous or their engagement towards cooperatives. And it was more complex than this idea of 2 armies that are confronted. So I wanted to understand this aspect by going to the places. And one of the formative experiences in this sense, sorry for the music, in that sense is basically that one of my first field visit was with a former indigenous guerrilla. And he took me to this place and he talked me about how people organized. So together with this archive, this visual archive, and what I heard from people and how they organize, it was different, I think, to approach the phenomenon. So indeed, from these experiences, it was like the need to go to state formation and struggles during the 19th century. And in that sense, answering to the second question, I do think that Plantation has a very very hard nucleus of violence that can express sometimes even through genocide. Then there's a question about finca, plantation, and estamento, caste. Could you talk a little bit about those elections? So yes, so the idea of casta, which is a translation into Spanish, I think does not reflect the sociological complexity of both military positions and appropriation. I wanted to show both of them because it promotes the idea of a much more integrated phenomenon in that sense, rather than just an ethnic division or colonial division of certain peoples. And about finca or plantation, well, that is very important. I think that, for example, there was one of the questions related with peasant wars in the 20th century by Eric Wolf. This is a very important work. And he actually traces these wars through a crisis in the agrarian world. So I think that it has a long tradition of discussing this. And for the case of Rafael Carrera, I haven't read the book that was suggested. Mainly, I read the book by Ralph Lee Woodward, which is an expert on Rafael Carrera's regime. So I wanted to also to follow some of these reflections and to criticize some of the Guatemalan Communist Party interpretation of Rafael Carrera's revolution as something that was like breaking the Central American Federation, and to provide a much more nuanced understanding of the collective phenomenon. That would be all.
All right, any other questions? I invite you to unmute yourselves if you have a question. It's just easier to have a conversation rather than me reading the questions. A little bit more organic discussion.
I could go ahead and
Go ahead.
just read the question that I typed in the chat, but
Great,
thank you so much. Yeah, my question is really around Mayan agricultural practices and milpas, and just wondering if you have thought about the relationship between finca agriculture and milpa agriculture, and if you could just outline how you connect those two things together in this historical context, or just really any thoughts about Mayan subsistence milpa agriculture. I'd just be really curious to hear more about that. Thank you.
Yes, I do think that it is important to historically differentiate the different stages of finca. It is different to think finca productivity in the 1870s and 1880s, for example, that right now in 1980 or 1990, it has changed a lot, but also the relationship between the highland Guatemala and plantations in the South Coast, in the sense that it was basically breaking a territory and a mobilization between that people used to go to the warm territories and also to return to the cold territories, and the finca actually broke with this. So there are several works on this, and basically also to analyze the difference between plantations in the South Coast and plantations in the highlands. For example, the so-called finca de mozos, which was basically to appropriate land in the highlands and then to rent some of this same land for people to go and work 2 months, 3 months a year in the South Coast. So there are like many aspects here, and some of the census of the agrarian census from 1964, 1979 also provide very important aspects to understand even exchange value and use value contradictions within communities, which is really interesting. And how, for example, the more the finca grew at the same time, it was like breaking with the possibilities of self nourishment or food for people. So in that sense, there are several aspects that we can see the contradictions, I would think.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Any other questions for Sergio or any other comments?
Can I make a comment? Sergio, when I was reading your book, it gave new meaning to something that was said about right-wing President Álvaro Uribe in Colombia. And that was that he ran Colombia like a finca. And in fact, he has a long tradition of being of a finca background. And it made me think about the ways in which what you propose in your study of the centrality of the finquero state might actually be applied to a number of other places in Latin America for thinking about the relationships, for instance, not only between different sectors of society. I'm going to use sector because caste doesn't necessarily apply in all cases, and the state, but also with the armed forces, right? And the and what the implications are of societies or states where export agriculture that required the concentration of land, for instance, and often was at the expense of the destruction either of resguardos in a place like Colombia, or of the environment in ways where lands that weren't necessarily, that didn't belong, baldíos, right, public lands, that didn't necessarily belong either to to communities, but were understood as being open for the use of everyone and gradually become increasingly privatized, right? How it actually can give us some interesting insights into thinking about conflict in these societies outside of the paradigm of the Cold War, which may magnify it and does in certain cases. Anyway, I just wanted to make that comment because it was interesting. It started me thinking. It's an anecdote in relation to Álvaro Uribe, but there are some very specific aspects of what it means when you run a country like it's a finca, right? Both in terms of paternalism, in terms of the way you understand rights and inclusion, but also domination and the use of force to restrain or foreclose certain kinds of possibilities. I just wanted to note that. And one last thing, and that is, I am so envious of the quality of this book. For those of you, I had a physical copy. It is a beautiful thing. The pages are glossy and silky. The print is gorgeous. There is a pleasure to be derived from reading what is both a very, very good book and an absolutely fabulous edition. It made me envious. I want UAM to publish my work. Anyway, I just wanted to say that.
Thank you. Maybe on that note, Sergio, you can tell us about the process of publishing the book with UAM and how that happened.
Okay, I will try because right now the other church started also practicing. Oh, I will do my best. So yes, so actually in 2014, Mario Vázquez, who was then the head of the CIALCA Centro de Investigaciones de América Latina y el Caribe, similar to CLACS in UNAM, they organized these meetings, these talks about the Guatemalan War. So I went to talk a little bit about the guerrilla patterns between 1978 and 1982. And he asked me for some material to read also for students. So I shared my thesis, my master thesis in that moment. Some months later, he asked me if it would be good, like to publish this book. So So it started a long process because first it was with Universidad Autónoma Universidad de la Ciudad de Mexico, and then we changed to the CIALCA. So it was published until 2020. It was like a 7-year period. So that is part of the process, and it was published in the middle of the pandemic, and you know some of the difficulties of that moment. Yes.
Any other questions? We have comments congratulating you, congratulating the panel, the participants. And how can people access the book, the physical book?
Yes, actually right now there are copies at the UNAM library in Mexico City and here in Guatemala in 2 libraries. So it was not like a big printing, was only like 300 books, but the PDF can be accessed through internet. So if somebody would like to read it, it's accessible through UNAM's library.
Yeah, I shared the link with everyone in the chat for those who want to read it in Spanish. All right, it seems like everybody's quiet.
There's one last question by Kimberly. Did you see on the chat here?
Wow.
She was just your journey as a scholar, as a sociologist, and to becoming an anthropologist. You can see that's kind of one. Probably take that as the last question.
Well, to be honest, I studied sociology to understand Guatemala, and then when I started to understand Guatemala, I also wanted a revolution in my country. That was the desire in this moment, and it has been the desire. Perhaps we are in different historical moments, and it doesn't have to express through the same means that before. But I do want to change in my country, and that has been like the whole horizon through these different stages. That's all that I would like to say.
I'm muted. Thank you everybody for being here with us today. I'm sure you have sold this book brilliantly, both the commentators and the author, and we look forward to reading it in Spanish. Hopefully it will be available in English down the road, or your dissertation. We also look forward to hearing more from your research, recent research, and more from your work. Thank you so much, Sergio, Mark, Mary, Maria Luisa, and everybody in the audience for being with us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you.